Hello. Hi, everyone. I can hear the recording in progress message pop up in different places. Okay. I'm gonna have to mute. Not you, Mariam, not you, Andre. You were muted by mistake. All right, so hello, everybody. We are very excited and happy to welcome you to this special session of Indelible's second annual Festival of Literature. And for those who are attending the second time, we're very happy that you're with us again. And for those who are attending for the first time, we hope that you enjoy this indelible experience. And I'm pretty sure that with Andre with us tonight, it is going to be a special experience indeed. I'd like to give special thanks again to our festival sponsors for this year, the American University in Dubai, the University of Gabriele D'Annunzio in Italy, EBSCO Host Information Services, Montessori Academy Australia, Pedagogy and Beyond, the International Association for Jungian Studies, and Salmon Poetry. So for those of you who don't know me, I am the editor of Indelible. I may have rejected or accepted your poetry. Either way, you know who I am now. And my lovely co-host for today is Mariam. Mariam, who is an AUD alumna and one of our brightest AUD poets, actually. And of course, our special guest. All of you are here to hear André Naffis-Sahely's lovely poetry and to have a little chat with him during the Q&A session after his poetry reading. So we will have a Q&A. I would like to ask you, please, to make sure that your mics are muted during the talk in order to avoid any interfering background noise. You may either type your questions and comments into the chat box, or alternatively, you may want to use the raise hand function by clicking on the participant button available, at which point either Mariam or I may invite you to unmute your mics and so that you could ask your question. So finally, and without further ado, we would like to introduce Andre. I will hand it over to you, Mariam.
All right, so I'm glad to be here, everyone, and I'm looking forward to introducing André Naffis-Sahely. He's a very interesting poet. So André Naffis-Sahely's second collection, High Desert, will be published by Blood Axe Books in June 2022. He is the author of the Promised Land poems from Itinerant Life, Penguin UK, and the editor of The Heart of a Stranger, an anthology of exile literature. He is from Abu Dhabi, but was born in Venice to an Iranian father and an Italian mother. He has translated over 20 titles of fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. He is a lecturer at University of California, Davis, in the US, and the editor of Poetry London in the UK.
Thank you, Mariam, and thank you, Rula. I'm really glad to be reading here today, and hello to all of you, wherever you are. I'm really happy that you can join us today. And yeah, I thought I would begin with, I guess, stemming from the bio, because The Promised Land is largely, I think, about my time in growing up in the Emirates, a country that I love dearly and have returned to over the years, even though I stopped living there. But I don't often read this poem, partly because I think perhaps it's a childhood memory I always tried to forget for a while, but that's what books of poems are for, resurrecting old memories like that. And so I thought I'd start with the medieval Italian village where, just outside of Venice, where the journey began. It was the last place I lived in Italy before I left to go live in the Emirates in Abu Dhabi. So I thought I would start with that. And it's called San Zenone degli Ezzelini. There was only a church, a school, and a bar, where old men sipped spritzers until dusk. A dual carriageway cut through the town, but nobody ever stopped. Now and then, there was a car crash. An elderly couple once burned alive inside their Ferrari after hitting a lamppost. Their obituary in the local newspapers read, "Out of towners, dead." San Zenone was where my father had taken up carpet selling. His office was a storehouse of dust and debts, with a samovar in view of the window. The town had once belonged to the Ezzelinis, ruthless aristocrats who preyed on the weak in the wastelands between the Pope and their emperor. Their most famous son, Ezzelino III, nicknamed the Terrible, once won his father's soul during a game of dice and refused to give it back. In 1254, 6 years after he was excommunicated, Pope Alexander IV launched a crusade against him, the only crusade ever declared on a single man. Although he didn't know it, it was the beginning of the end. Ezzelino gradually started losing his battles. After months of retreats and failed sieges, a lone arrow brought him down at Cassano. Foreseeing his own doom, Alberico, Ezzelino's brother, hid in San Zenone's tower. From its heights, Alberico watched his children dismembered and dragged through the streets until dead. Sometime before the inevitable, Alberico learned that Ezzelino had betrayed him with his dying breath, the final act of revenge. The tower is featured on San Zenone's coat of arms, where a giant snake peered out of its stones, its tongue red and snarling. "What is that?" I once asked my primary school teacher. "It reminds us of the poison that lurks in our families." So now that I've read that poem, I wanted to move on to perhaps one of the earliest poems that I read that I wrote for the Promised Land, and it's a poem that took a while to find its shape. I think there were several versions of it where I just frustratingly trying to find the right shape for it, but I settled on something relatively prosy, and it's called "Disposable Cities." They begin as blips on the horizon of prospects, rumors, snippets of exaggerated talk, too fabulous to believe, but too alluring to forget. Something has been found: gold, silver, uranium, coltan, or oil. Before long, the prospect of immeasurable wealth drowns all incredulity. The migration begins. The engineers in their hard hats and linens are the first on the ground, and with them come derricks, drills, platforms, and dry docks. Pipelines sink their tentacles into every lucrative crevice marked on the map. The maps are kept secret. A handful of shacks are erected to provide a few basic services. Soon enough, the handful swells into a hamlet, then a village, and finally a city. Such cities are the perfect sort of settlement for the modern world. Everything is shipped in, everything is easily assembled. Their primary and overriding purpose is to extract, process, and distribute. Just like a motorized pump draws water out of a well, they start inhaling people from all over the world, one desperado at a time. At first, these new arrivals find their new homes unsettling. They find it difficult to adjust to the weird climates and are frazzled by the confusion of languages. No one is under any illusions. They are ephemeral guests, non-citizens. Belonging is a dream best forgotten or deferred. Most have come empty-handed, having traded their old lives for grub stakes. Lots of money sloshes around, but most of it is spent simply surviving. And when it runs out, people watch their lives fall apart. Everyone exists in a heightened state of awareness. One false move and they're gone. The poorer they are, the more modest their gambles, which more often than not make them poorer. Beggars don't build homelands, they tell themselves, fantasizing about the day when they might return home and become somebody. The myth, meanwhile, has traveled to the four corners of the planet. More than cities, these Eldorados are a state of mind, places where people come to reinvent themselves and realize their most eccentric fantasies. All conurbations live out their lot and die, But these disposable cities are special. They thrive in areas of the world generally deemed inhospitable or uninhabitable. In Greenland, Siberia, the Amazon, the Yukon, or the empty quarter. They are mushrooms of greed, requiring no loving care or attention. They simply erupt and flourish. Yet their fame is fleeting. Once they're bled dry, these cities' roads go raw with potholes. Chickens run loose in the opera houses. Power lines sag, and rot seeps in, tarring all in sight. Only those unlucky enough not to make it stay in town for the decline. One day, the wind howls and the last tent comes undone. The lie has moved on to the next disposable city. When I was a child, my mother used to tell me that lies had short legs and thus could not get very far. Somebody lied to her. I wanted to read now the poem that I think describes the journey leaving that little Italian village. And it's called Escaping East. It was like going on holiday permanently. Even though I was 6, I steered my own ship, or pretended to, perched atop suitcases, rolling along the corridors at Frankfurt International. While half the world swept west, we trickled eastward, one by one, single file, like fugitives. Next stop, Abu Dhabi, where my father had a job and money for the first time in years. Our house was squeezed between the Russian embassy and a cemetery, the latter the healthier looking of the two. The embassy was a model of the Yeltsin era, that nauseating smell of rot and booze. The officers swaying either side of a gate with a hammer and sickles silhouette still legible in the wood. When bored, I would ring the bell just to hear a drunken da bellow from the other side. The gate stayed shut. I watched the guards from my mashrabia, our first floor balcony, as they cursed the heat and loosened their belts. Like them, I put on weight. Everything seemed edible in this city. Everywhere you looked were fast food outlets, the vanguard of obesity. There was so much food, in fact, that the streets were sticky with its stains and residues. Each evening, the grocer nearest us left crates of unwanted mangoes and limes outside his shop, and within hours, they fermented into chutney, leaving gooey puddles where the cats would feed and fuck. One day, the cemetery gate was left ajar, and without hesitation, I snuck in to breathe some air, a bit of clean air. The next poem I wanted to read is called Vanishing Act. It's a poem that people have particularly liked from the book. Only 2 out of 10 people die in Abu Dhabi. The rest simply fail to have their visas renewed. They are bagged, tagged, and placed on the next available flight back to wherever they first came from, the one-way ticket experience par excellence. Every edifice on this island is crafted by these almost nothings. In death, at least, there is solace. Never again to queue for days on end. Never again to have their fingertips inked and pressed by intolerant hands. Their blood screened for undesirable illnesses. Their flesh seared by a sun that wonders what the hell they're doing there. Throughout my time in Abu Dhabi, I was lucky enough to live by the sea some of the time. A lot of the time we lived in places where it was a little more inaccessible, even though it's an island. We lived quite in the interior of the island, but for some of the years we lived not too far from the sea. And in one of those houses was next to the old port, Mina Zayed. And the poem is named after the port. So Mina Zayed. It's late afternoon and the market looks like a used car lot. I watch men conduct business from the backs of their trucks. There's not much on sale today. Spices, pots, bags of nuts, cracked ceramic ashtrays. A few customers stroll by, but it's too muggy to haggle. The sleepiness of the place is broken only by the stinging, oddly invigorating smell of diesel in the air. The port lies just a short distance from here, and the ships on the horizon rise and dip like the humps of a great caravan of steel, slowly winding its way from the west to the west. An entire country is being built from scratch. There are cargo containers as far as the eye can see. The sun sets while the market grows ever more deserted, as if it were the ragged rearguard of the past or an inscrutable prototype of the future. Often when we talk about immigration and life spent in various places, I think we always tend to fixate on the beginning, on the journey there, and on the life that unfolds there. But quite often we don't really pay much attention to what happens to people after they flush out, essentially, when their dream of belonging somewhere else doesn't quite work out. And this is a poem that I wrote for my mother not long after they left the Emirates and when she went back to Italy. And it's called Sehnsucht. Our family has become a government in exile, and visiting you is like paying my respects to a kindly, downhearted minister who is equally fearful of past, present, and future. 2 small rooms to eat and sleep in. Only the essentials escape being boxed up while awaiting their destination. Still, they wait. This is home for now, a little town outside Florence, where the streets are lifeless and the old stick their necks out of windows like turtles keeping an eye out for vultures. When apart, we speak only a little, a pair of talking heads in a penumbra. I look at you, a housewife without a house, without a husband too. Pondering it all, I chew antacids with a sovereign indifference. Your younger son, your adjutant or aide-de-camp, shuts himself in his room all day and shoots aliens, Nazis or terrorists on his console, almost as if training for a war to reconquer our lives. My family tended to go, we spent a lot of time in the Emirates. Some periods were longer than others. My father worked on and off in the Emirates between 1980 and 2017, so quite a long time. And a few years after I left to go study in England, I started returning for regular visits, and this is called the return. I get stamped in like a tourist. It's 7 a.m. and my father's waiting for me at arrivals. We drive along the impossibly wide highways over the bridge to the island of Abu Dhabi. 60 years ago, there was almost nothing here. A single mud brick fort where the ruler and his family lived, a few brackish wells, an airstrip, and a handful of huts. Now it accommodates 1.5 million people from just about anywhere on Earth and hosts a Formula One Grand Prix. My father pulls up in the parking lot in the middle of Batin, a residential neighborhood. On entering the 3-story building where he and my mother live, I spot a succession of bright red crosses spray painted on nearly every wall, door, and hallway. It's Passover at King Herod's. My father explains that an official from the municipality inspected the building last week and ordered all partitions torn down in accordance with new planning regulations. Most of the building is held up by light interior walls that sound like ripe watermelons when you rap your knuckles against them. The municipality has given my parents 2 days to knock down the walls, or they'll cut off their gas, water, and electricity. Over the years, my family has acquired a breathtaking proficiency in paring their lives down to the bare essentials. Living in the UAE is like assembling a Jenga tower, then nervously trying to remove as many blocks as you can without the entire edifice collapsing on you. Once the walls are gone, my parents will get a reprieve from the city authorities, like the rest of their anxious fellow tenants, at which point the game starts all over again. Part of the difficulty in writing this book, I think, lay in deciding just how much dirty laundry to air, not just about myself, the place where I live, but including my family. And this is a poem that proved to be quite difficult to write, but I think it was still worth it. Definitely sums up the moment. And it's called Infidelity. The bin man lifts the lid on the hungry, scurvy cats and waves a weak hello as he combs the trash for snacks. I sit on the balcony, semi-naked, and wave back. My cold Olympian brutality stirs with my first cup of coffee, and I catch myself wishing this town would burn to the ground. The inexorable sun rises into view and greases the palms with its light. A removal van beeps into position. The piano teacher, my mother's rival, is preparing herself to move. For months, the two have waged a guerrilla war, my mother flicking ash into her garden, the other making clothes slip from their pegs and mysteriously disappear. After 3 years in Florence, my mother returned to her husband and suddenly found herself the other woman, displaced by my father's fear of death, a male disease that only knows one cure. Now their conjugal life lies in limbo, and I watch these people, once jovial, become slowly infected with nihilism, hermit crabs too poor for new shells. But how lasting is love anyway? As Churchill once said to the King of Bahrain, we try never to desert our friends, that is, unless it's in our interest. The sun reaches its peak and a kitten climbs to the top of a small dune in the half-empty parking lot. It spends an hour attempting to defecate, but can't. It hasn't eaten enough. I've seen too much. I shut my eyes and dive back into the murky ocean of memory. Not too long ago, I edited, Mariam Kendley mentioned, I edited a poetry magazine in London. And not too long ago, we published a piece about how poets sometimes feel that they have to present themselves as good people in poems. And part of the reason I published that was because that's something that I've tried to do with my own work, as in present myself as who I really am, regardless of the consequences or what people might think, because I think poetry relies on an engine of truth to actually get it going. And so this was the poem that I think the writing of inspired me to publish that piece in the magazine. It was by the poet Rory Waterman. And the poem is called Flying on New Year's Eve. And like many of the poems in the book, it's dedicated to my father. Please try to forget us, my mother said, as I hosted myself into the truck with my one good hand. The other hand was swollen, the size of a dragon fruit. That was the one I had beaten my brother with. Our family's falling apart, and he won't even lift his gaze from the screen. None of this matters, goes his sad generation's motto. I'd rather stare at a wall than read a book, he told me, and all hell broke loose. My rage wore me like a glove, and I landed a right hook on him again and again. Later, on the way to the airport, my father stopped for a pound bag of ice where I buried my bruised spider. Near the border with Dubai, we passed a rusty bus crammed with skinny men in blue jumpsuits. Such men's lives are as cheap as the cloth on their backs, if not cheaper. Some reward for the follies they build. Now, all along the drive, I try to spot some familiar sight from my youth, but anything over 20 years old is a historical landmark or gone, mostly gone. I could murder a drink, but that's out of the question too. Just then, like a mirage, a round building of the government's shaped like a hip flask looms from the heat haze. The cap won't come undone. When we reach departures, almost too late, my father starts to tremble again. It's his heart spells. He hasn't eaten anything today and is kept on his feet by the patriarch's insatiable need to provide, to appear impervious to aging. How long will he last? Old men, unlike old women, seem to wobble into their dotages like panicky toddlers. I smile like a Sunday drunk and hug my father goodbye, at which point he says, "Please don't forget us." Then I hear the last call and dash off, dragging my reluctant Ronzinante of a suitcase. Allah's moral monotony oozes from the loudspeakers. I thought I'd shift away from the Emirates. I think the book was written as an assemblage of portraits of various promised lands. I was asked a few times why I didn't call it a promised land, and the reason for that is I was talking about the promised land as a construct, as a manifestation that kind of appears all over the planet at different times in different places for different reasons. And although large parts of it are set in the Emirates, I also set a lot of it, some of the poems towards the end in the US, where I went to live a few years ago. And there's a poem from there that I dedicated to my wife and that I wrote for her. And it's called In the Catskills. This is for Zinzi. We were trapped in a town called Liberty. Our cabin lay on top of a hill where the snow kept us caged for whole weeks at a time. Down the road, past a couple of bends, lay the hamlet of Neversink, which of course had been drowned by a reservoir. It was hard to think of anything human around us as serious. All men had built reeked of failure and rust. We lived amidst the ruined remnants of a Yankee industrial frontier town. Slumbering mills, silent railroads, idle factories, hollow houses, a few drowsy strip malls. It was the nonsensical heart of angry America, where descendants of Unionists flew Dixie flags just to spite the dark man in the White House. The only decent bite to eat was at Stew's, a blue Coleman diner formerly on 49th and 11th that got pushed out by franchises, then exiled upstate on a flatbed, never to return. When the mulch plant shut down, the sons and daughters of liberty debated at length the great prospects before them, casinos or fracking. But the rich second homeowners fought the nasty oilmen and won, and good for them. After all, they hardly spend any time there. Liberty, son, an old school teacher told me, is where the past comes to die. Ain't it funny to think, my beloved, that this was where our future began? There's a section of the book that I hardly ever read from, and it's prefaced by this lovely quote by a writer that, if you haven't read, I'd really recommend. It's the Hungarian writer Antal Zerb, and the quote is, "History is my only country." And I think partly because of living in between so many different homelands, so many different promised lands, I ended up finding my real refuge in the pages of history books. And so I wrote a small section of poems at the back of the book, inspired by various episodes from history, many of them classical. And as I know that there's quite a few poets in the audience, I thought I'd read one in particular that I wrote relatively early on, which discusses the copious rewards that come from writing poetry. And it's called "Put Not Your Trust in Princes." After 4 decades of early mornings and late nights, Ferdowsi had completed his epic, the Shahnameh, and thus he decided to visit Sultan Mahmud, who'd once promised him a gold piece per couplet. Ferdowsi had written 60,000 of them. Unfortunately, Sultan Mahmud was dejected. The long years of peace were proving hard to bear without the rich, gluey feel of blood on his hands. He sent the poet home with a mere sack of silver. Years later, as the Sultan was about to ride into battle, a minister recited a sad song of singular beauty. And when the Sultan learned that Ferdowsi was its author, he immediately sent him a caravan laden with gold. But as the caravan entered the city through one gate, Ferdowsi's remains were being wheeled out the other. There's a poem in here, again, from this section of historical poems that I also wanted to read, and it's called Patience. The old Roman emperors knew a thing or two about exile. On discovering a poet who had taken too many liberties, or a relative grown uncomfortably popular, they selected an island, ideally somewhere sunny, Africa, perhaps, or a rocky outpost off the coast of Sicily. Then, having chosen a location that was suitably isolated, they dispatched their prisoner there. At first, life wasn't so bad for the new exile. Letters from friends came and went, and servants catered to their every need. The climate was pleasant, the villa spacious, their allowance ample, and their stay, they were assured, only temporary. The exile was allowed to roam freely within the village. Occasionally, they even made friends. As the years went by, a routine of small pleasures would help to mitigate the exile's nostalgia, making their longing almost bearable. Languishing in indolence, however, the exile would grow to look upon his changeless fate as worse than death itself. And finally, when the emperor saw that if enough time had elapsed, the soldiers were dispatched, small handfuls of men at arms who, washing ashore on the island under cover of darkness, would bring the long vacation to its promised end. How am I doing for time? Is there another, should I be another?
Yes, there is time. Yeah, don't worry about
Great.
it.
I'll read this last one. It's dedicated to a poet that I feel like I learned from, Mark Ford, learned him for quite a bit, and it's called Atticus. Unlike many of the sad schemers Rome birthed in his time, Titus Pomponius Atticus is best remembered for how he died, and not for what he tried and failed to conquer. Indeed, the gods never abandoned him, as they did Cicero, Caesar, Brutus, and Antony. Yet to say he played both sides and lived a long and contented life at the expense of others would be terribly unjust. In times of need, friend and foe alike found food and drink under his canopy, and though he shook many a hand, none were ever greased. 77 and still untouched by scandal, an ulcer took hold of him and took him hard. After 3 months spent in bed, old Titus, stoic as ever, placed a hand over his loins and whispered, "Enough." That was when he decided to die, to starve himself until his life slipped from his lips. When his fast was in its second day, the fever, as though frightened by the man's stubbornness, left him suddenly. Begged by wife and friends to relent, Titus submerged himself in silence, and for 3 days bore his hunger with the utmost dignity, until death finally took him on the 5th. Many wept at the sight of his litter leaving his home on its way to the Appian. Little else is known of Titus, who set still less store by his words, and history, as if to reward him, has ensured that none are remembered, allowing by that no shadow to fall on his memory, as often befalls a great many of those we hear about, who gossip without a stray thought for posterity. Thank you very much. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you all for listening. You're very kind.
Thank
And
you
thank you
very
again,
much.
Mariam and Rula. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. I love how your poems actually capture moments of history, and they capture moments in memory as well, and they bring them back to life at this very moment. And what I love most about it is the theme that we are all citizens of the world. And we can actually see, hear, feel, taste, the pain of immigrants, the pain of people who are away from homes, the pain of finding the notion of home. So it's very beautiful. And thank you so much. We are truly honored to have you share it with us tonight. And I would like to invite the audience right now to ask André a question. So you may use the chat box if you wish. And if you would like to use the microphone, please just press on the hand button so we can see you. Okay, Micah says, that was a really good poetry reading. Thanks so much, André. Munira Al-Mullah says, beautiful poetry. Wow. So you're getting some fan mail right now, André.
Thank you so much, very kind.
Okay, yeah, well, there's some comments from before. Oh, and there's a new message here. Ibrahim. Ibrahim says, this is the first time I've ever understood a poem. Really interesting. Wow. Yeah, there's this notion of poetry being very difficult to understand. And sometimes this is the deterrent for so many who are not really in touch with contemporary poetry.
Rula, can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, Micah, please.
So, André, thanks a lot for that. That was really like a really wonderful poetry reading. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm curious how your poetry about the Emirates is received by audiences in the United States or in the UK, like particularly people who have never been to the Emirates or only know about the Emirates through media representations. So I'd just be curious to know, like, if, like, how those sorts of poems are read or received by audiences there.
Thank you for the question, Micah. It's the answer's not easy, pretty layered in the sense that, I think, quite frankly, I think they've usually been met with complete indifference in the sense that it's a part of the world that I think, like many others, gets often misrepresented, very under discussed. I think it's a place that, despite its fame, because I think it's inarguable to say that the UAE, and especially I would say still to this day, this has been the case ever since I've lived there anyway, but the city of Dubai in particular has achieved great global fame. They used to call it once upon a time, they used to call it the Arab Singapore. I think now they call Singapore the Asian Dubai, so I think the tables have flipped in that way. So it's a city that attracts a lot of attention, but there's not much writing about it at all. I think, frankly, whenever I've tried to write about it, it's always felt like editors doing me a favor and letting me write about it, rather than actually commissioning pieces. I think it's been my experience. I've written pieces for various magazines about my time there, or poems about it, but quite often I was actually told to my face that I was wasting my time, because it was a part of the world that did not merit to be written about. I think you can read whatever implications you can into that. I think there's a lot of racism, frankly, that goes into within having that kind of understanding of the place. I think one of the reasons I actually became determined to write about it in my first book, The Promised Land, was the fact that I had an American editor many years ago. We're talking almost 12 now at this point, who said, you could definitely write about somewhere else. Why are you wasting your time? And I'm definitely not going to take any of these poems. And I think that the average reaction to it is being much the same, really, across the board. So I don't know if that answers your question fully, but that's a summation of my experience, and then with writing prose pieces about it, the situation was usually that I would write for these magazines about other countries that I've been to or other situations, and then essentially I would say to them, look, I've always wanted to write about Abu Dhabi, will you let me? And usually they say yes, but that's after I've written for them for a while, so it's kind of like I guess they give me the commission to shut me up, I think, half the time. So yeah, I hope that answers the question there.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Andre. There's a comment from Glenda who says, I like the cats wandering through in their own lives as they drift unknowingly in your story. And someone, I'm sorry, I don't know the name, it just says Dot. Someone asks, do you think your childhood in Abu Dhabi has formed your style of poetry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, I'm indelibly shaped by the city, you know. I think I've through the writing of a writer I deeply admire, who also grew up in Abu Dhabi like me, Deepak Krishnan. I started referring to myself as an Abu Dhabian. It was one of those moments where I never thought that that's what I should refer to myself as, and then he kind of, you know, made it clear for me, you know, by using an expression that when you see it, you think, why have I not been using this my whole life? So yeah, I think it absolutely shaped um, my individuality, not just as a writer, but as a person. It's where I really started to feel like I belong somewhere. I never felt like I only spent the first 5 years of my life in Venice, where my mother's people are from, but I always felt quite unwanted there. So for me, moving to the Emirates, being able to mix with people from various cultures, I think was really a revelation for me. I never really turned back from that. It's where I consider my real life to have begun. So yeah, I think in whichever way that's shaped my poetry, I think it really has left an indelible mark. Yeah.
Right, thank you, Andre. We have a comment from Dr. Norbert Hirschhorn, wonderful poet, medical doctor, and the man who saved 8 billion lives. Dr. Hirschhorn says, your poems remind me of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. Well done. And we have a question, another question by Ibrahim. My question is, how did you learn contemporary poetry? How do you know that you're on the right track?
Trial and error, mostly on the error side of things. So lots of failure. You know, failure is the true source of all education, of all improvement. You know, so I think it was trial and error. I think reading widely. You know, that was how I learned, and I'm still learning, because I think using that in the past tense is completely idiotic, really. You know, in the sense that I'll never stop learning. None of us should, really. So. I think it was trying and failing. I think also the poet Derek Walcott had an idea about how one should start writing or develop writing. And I don't know if he was entirely accurate, but I think that what he said always stuck with me. I read it in an essay that he wrote many years ago, where he said that poets, when they're starting out, should very stubbornly imitate the writers that they like, almost as if they're writing cheap knockoffs of the original. And by trying to figure out how to write to those heights, I think they will be able to figure out their true original style. So by consciously imitating someone, you start to figure out what really drew you to that poet in particular, and how you yourself are different. You know, and I think that tended to be quite a useful practice for me. When I read this essay by Walcott, I had basically started to do the same myself unconsciously. I won't claim that it was a conscious process, but again, when I read Walcott's essay, it made sense to me, because that was the kind of practice that I adopted. So I began with imitation in the hopes of achieving some, you know, a little bit of originality. So that was, you know, the simple way in which I approached it.
That's very interesting. And Glenda says also, writing about what you want to write about is never a waste of time. Writing to order or to please others often is.
Indeed. That's exactly right. Well said.
And Mahabba Nasir says, is there a place or topic that you've been wanting to write about? One that you haven't written about yet?
Yeah, you know what? Yes, there is, and it's about the concept of gross national happiness, and the way that it's developed over the years, particularly in the nation of Bhutan, but the way that it's, I think, quickly over time gaining traction and becoming something that's actually being adopted by other countries. Not too many at this point, only about half a dozen. But I think that it's a very interesting concept on one hand, and a very dangerous one on the other. And perhaps linking back to one of my earlier answers, that's something that I've absolutely failed in interesting editors about. So I pitched that story several times, but no one's quite interested. I think, when you're trying to challenge a certain kind of preconception about a specific place, then you're going to face a lot of resistance, So I think it's a human instinct that we have. We like to remain in the safety of the ideas that feel comfortable and settled rather than try to upset them. So yeah, Bhutan and gross national happiness.
We have a question from Romalyn. Hello, Romalyn. Those of you who saw the latest issue of Indelible, poet Romalyn Anti is our cover poet. And Romalyn asks, how do you explore worldwide and politically important issues with such care and groundedness? How can we do this in our own poems?
Well, thank you, Roland. I'm glad that you think I explore them with care and groundedness. I often wonder whether I do. I'm not sure I can offer a how-to guide in how to approach that, but I think honesty seems to me the primary compass. I think one of the quotes that I really live by in the book is by the French writer André Naffis-Sahely, where he said, "It was neither true nor false, it was lived." So I think, what I tried to do in the book was not claim a universal truth or a summary judgment on a place or an experience, but it was just trying to be a chronicle of life as I remembered it, and memory being the tricky beast that it is, which is why I think you also have to constantly re-examine yourself, re-examine memory. Therapy won't hurt, I'll tell you that, in terms of examining memory as well, So yeah, that's I think the primary compass. So long as you're trying to be honest with yourself and with the reader, then I think you can't really get it wrong. And I think to also understand the poetry is meant to be at the service of people. It really is. It's not I think that sometimes we can, all of us perhaps, lapse into this idea that it's very personal and that it's a hobby. It's not. It's a public service. It always has been, always should be. And so long as I think that's kept in mind, then exploring politically important issues, I think, comes as a matter of course, as a natural consequence of your activities.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you so much for the wonderful question, Roma. And Romalyn will be starring a session on the 6th of April, so we hope to see you all there as well.
I'm looking forward to that.
And the next question is by Thani. Thani Khaled asks, what really is the thought process when you try to write a poem?
Trying to start with, it's almost like, I would hate to speak for musicians, given that I've never been able to play an instrument to save my life despite several attempts. I was also terrible at mathematics, so there's various interconnections there as to why I was never able to do that. But having lived with enough of them, especially in university, I remember that they would kind of sit around and hear this note or motif and then try to extend it and work with it. And I think by the same coin with poetry, for me, it's always worked on an emotional level where there's a certain feeling or emotion that's floating around, whether it's got something to do with me or something to do with someone around me or the people around me or the city around me. And then as soon as I get that emotional kind of frequency, I try to embed ideas into it. Whatever happens to be going through my mind at the time, or I think ideas that will marry well with that emotion. So I think that's the process there. I know it can be it's quite vague, but it is a nebulous process, right? The way that we create. And so that's probably the best I can do. Just trying to pick up notes here and there and trying to work them into something that can be sustained. Yeah.
Okay, well, I like the part that when you said that you were not that great at mathematics, I can so relate to that. I still tell people that I'm allergic to numbers, and I've also never really played a musical instrument. So thanks for making me feel better. And Royson says, brilliant. Thank you so much. What a wonderful reading and insightful questions and answers. Moza Al-Shamsi asks, what inspired you to start writing?
Well, a few things, but I think one of them was the desire to leave a kind of record behind. I think, especially when you have the background like mine, and I imagine some of the people here might share that kind of background, where you've moved around a lot of times through financial necessity, and you feel like you're kind of smoke just flying about in the world, and you don't really leave anything permanent behind you. And it it was something that I think happened to me early on in the Emirates, where I knew that I didn't know how to write. I was quite aware of the fact that whatever I was writing was absolutely terrible, but I knew that I wanted to write something about my time, specifically in the Emirates, because I feel like I wanted to prove to myself that I'd been there, to prove to others that I'd been there, to leave a record of that experience behind before it vanished entirely. And so I think that was actually one of the chief motivations for it. But then there was also a quote by the Chilean poet Nicanor Parra, that always stuck with me, which was, poet must be a thorn in society's side. And that, I think, also is something that really attracted me. You got to be uncomfortable at times.
Musa asked, I believe, the same question that you just answered right now.
Yeah.
So he said, never mind, which means he got the answer already. Elena says, thank you for your beautiful gift of poetry. And Glenda says, a quote I like also from Andre Malraux: memory is a great artist. For every man and for every woman, it makes the recollection of his or her life a work of art and an unfaithful record.
Yes, absolutely.
And,
yeah, especially the unfaithful record part. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, well said.
Andre, do I have something to say? Well, I personally really enjoyed your poetry. There was something very genuine about it, and I just could, I could just feel what you were trying to say, and that it kind of took me back to your memories, even though I would say I do not relate to them. But it was just great to, get that experience that's not mine in poetry. And thank you so much. I actually had a question. So what poets do you enjoy reading? Like whose work do you enjoy?
Thank you so much, firstly, for the comment earlier as well. I think that's what poetry should do at its best, right? I think you get minds that may not be able to relate right away to meet and exchange. So thanks for that. The second part, I'll keep it to as an older poet I met once said, to safely dead poets, because running a magazine means I don't also want to offend more contemporary writers, and also because I tended to being told that I've got fairly old-fashioned tastes. Cesare Pavese was someone who was absolutely foundational for me. I don't know if many of you know here his work, but he was one of the great Italian poets of the early 20th century, and wrote these wonderful poems essentially about life in the countryside around Turin, about the lives of the poor, the broken, the complicated. And they were very simple, but very lyrical. And I remember that was where I first learned that you didn't have to be too complicated to write good poetry. And so that was pretty foundational for me. It was also something that told me that you're going to get into trouble even if you write simple poetry as well that's not complicated, because Pavese was famously exiled by Mussolini, even though he wrote poems that were completely non-political. So Mahmoud Darwish, I think, unsurprisingly, in many ways, I was able to read him in both the original and in translation. I had the honor of actually editing his books once. Well, the translation rather, not his actual book. And Robert Lowell was also quite a key influence for me. I think that I took a lot from Lowell, whether it was the the obsession with airing dirty laundry or using reported speech, or yeah. So I think those three poets were quite key for me. and yeah, I think also related to the various parts of my identity in many ways. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
for
you.
asking.
Salama Al-Suwaidi asks, what is your favorite piece of poetry that you've written?
Well, so I thank you for the question, but I suppose I've heard that whatever a poet says to answer that question apparently is always completely wrong. Because apparently we're not good judges of our own work. In fact, I think one of the poems that I wrote for the book that I thought was more like a draft or throwaway ended up being one of the ones that people really enjoyed the most. So I'm not sure that my idea is of what my favorite pieces of poems that I've written are is attestable, I guess. But I think one of the new ones that I've written, it's in my second book, which is called Tule Fog, which is a weird term I only picked up after I moved to the Central Valley. Tule Fog is what they call the thick layer of fog that settles over the Central Valley in California, one of the breadbaskets of the U.S. And it's a fog that just comes very suddenly and very violently. And the reason I like it right now is primarily because it took a long time to admit to myself what I wanted to write about. So I think I've ended up liking the poems where they didn't come easily. And I feel like I had to fight for them. Although that being said, the ones that people end up liking are the ones that come easily. So you tell me what the lesson to be drawn from there is, but yeah.
Okay. Elena asks a question similar to the one I was going to ask you. Do you write poetry in Italian too? How many languages do you speak and translate from? I was about to ask you if you wrote poetry in Arabic. So maybe you can answer me.
I can, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that happened in the UAE that I was happiest about was very early on during my time living there, the Ministry of Education passed a great law, which was, it doesn't matter if you're a foreigner and if you're attending a non-Emirati school, you have to learn Arabic. And I was at the right age where you picked up languages really easily. And so I picked up Arabic. And it's since gotten very rusty, but I can still read and write in the language. I arrived in the Emirates speaking only Italian, which wasn't even the language that was understood where my mother was from, because they only speak Venetian there for the most part. So I was always linguistically a bit of an oddball, but I picked up French, Italian, and Arabic in the UAE. And around the ages of 13 and 14, I was actually writing poetry in all four languages. But I ended up going for English, and I think the lexical breadth of the language attracted me. I think the access to an audience as well. I think it's something that I've learned reading the work of various writers. Morocco always strikes me as a good example, where I've met a lot of young Moroccan writers who have chosen to write in English, even though in their country there's a national body of literature being composed in 6 different languages, all of it good, all of it interesting. But I think believing myself to be a global citizen, however flawed a concept that may be, I think led me to pick the lingua franca of that part of the world. So I think English it was. But yeah, I wrote in Italian and in French, and it was all very different, and in Arabic too. But yeah. Yeah.
Do you ever mix? Do you ever write bilingual poems? I've never seen any, but do you? Have you ever?
I've got a little manuscript of poems that it's I mean the poet Michael Hoffman called it macaronic approach to languages, and I think that seems about right. So I've got a little parcel of work that I wrote in multiple languages, but I honestly never got them to a shape where I thought they were good enough to send out or to publish, but it's something that I'm honestly quite drawn to, both as an idea and as a practice. Whenever I've seen work of that nature, I actually judged the prize last year where the aim was to write poetry in various different languages within a single text. And I was quite blown away by the results. I'd like to think that that's where we're headed in many ways. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Mariam asks, Mariam Al-Marzuki, when you're writing, what's your typical work schedule?
Um, Never stopping, I think would be the simple answer to that. I think it's I tend to try and write most days, and I still to this day I make my living as a freelancer, meaning I do a variety of things. I teach a little bit, but primarily I write freelance and edit, and I make a little bit of money off my own work. Not enough, obviously, to actually make it work properly. But I think having a fairly busy kind of schedule helps in that approach. I think that and I say we because I don't think it's specific to anyone, can get a little too precious with sitting down and thinking about what we want to write about. Sometimes I think it's just about actually getting it done. And so typical work schedule, I mean, I'd like to keep it to something like a 9 to 5, but it never is. I don't think it's even 5 to 9. So yeah, I think it's what the craft requires in many ways, and also because I think anyone who's ever spent enough time writing, at some point, or else I'd be surprised if you didn't, but you're going to have people telling you, so it must be wonderful sitting around in your pajamas all day, kind of idling about. And so I think part of me always wanted to be neurotically busy to counter that idea, that impression, and not feel like I was just being lazy. I still feel lazy, so I don't know if it worked, but.
Yeah, I like the notion that it appears in James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. One of the characters, Shem the penman, Joyce calls him a squid. So his poetry is sort of like squid ink. So there's this notion that you kind of need to squeeze out the poetry, and it's not always because you have enough time to write it. Most of the time it's because, it just pops out when it pops out. Do you feel that way too? Do you feel that, it doesn't always happen at leisure time? You don't always have like 6 hours on end to write a poem, and sometimes it's just a word from here and a word from there, and then you kind of make the connection.
Absolutely. I mean, I actually ended up writing the final form of a lot of the poems in the Promised Land at airports, in gaps, waiting for a flight to take off, or just getting off a flight and getting stuck in queues for hours. Because I think sometimes we can overlabor these thoughts, right? And I think sometimes just actually getting down to it and finding these moments where you have a bit of time and really concentrating effort, I think can really work. So yeah, I agreed.
Okay, we have one more question here by Fanny. If you had the chance to work as something else, would you take it?
No, but I'd be lying if I said that the writing was my first love, because the real first love I had was archaeology. I was really quite fascinated by the whole thing, and I'll admit it. I think partly there was a bit of an Indiana Jones kind of idea of it that was completely false, obviously. So I think that's something that's often quite romanticized, but yeah, so that was a profession that always interested me, but and it was the only one before literature, but not now. Although I guess if someone put a gun to my head, I'd say sure, archaeologist, why not? Yeah, I like the idea of it.
And you've studied history, so
I did, exactly. Yeah. I did, yeah.
Hey,
I have
yes,
I have another question. Yes. So, do you have any tips for writers who want to publish? There's this thing where it's hard to publish poetry. So I've heard, like, publishers don't really want to publish poetry; they want to publish novels and so on. So, what do you have to say about that? And any tips?
Yeah, thank you. I think I've got maybe a couple of helpful things to say. I think one of them, and I know it's really difficult to do, and even writers who've been doing this for 30, 40 years and have won prizes would be absolutely lying through their teeth if they tried to pretend otherwise. But um, trying to think too much of the market and what the market expects and demands is never a good idea. However, keeping that out of your head, like I said, it's almost impossible. in the sense that sometimes it will sneak through and sometimes it'll make you feel sad and dejected and depressed. And so I think that that's, you know, a natural part of the writer's life. Also because, and this is incredibly true, and there's a lot of facts to back up this analysis. Publishers have this godlike power over authors, but they're still human beings, and they, like the rest of us, they also don't know what they're doing. So when a publisher says we're looking for this because it's commercially successful, quite often what happens is that they'll publish books that they think are going to be hits, and then they'll publish others that they think are going to be, you know, not necessarily failures, but that they're not going to do that well, and then the opposite happens. So the book that they thought was going to be a hit completely flounders, and the book that they thought that wasn't going to work out becomes the surprise hit. You know, I think probably everyone's here has heard of stories about, you know, famous writers getting, you know, rejected 20, 30 times, and then when they're finally published properly, they become a bestseller, or they become very influential and leave a lasting mark on audiences, on the canon. So I think perseverance really has to be key there. You know, you have to just keep at it, and believe in yourself enough to keep going. That being said, because that kind of an idea can have a downside too, you also have to be open to criticism. I think one of the best experiences I ever had was when I was, I did a creative writing MA in Scotland, and one of the poets who was teaching there at the time held up a poem that I'd written in 5 minutes, and it was terrible. And he held it up and said, "This is terrible. Please don't do this again. You should try and do better." And that ended up being a key experience for me. I think sometimes being told that your work needs to be improved is a good thing. Again, I think writers can get too precious. So yeah, so I think in a way it's this weird, no wonder writers can get very often frustrated, because on the one hand, you have to be a bit arrogant and believe yourself despite the fact that things may not work out for a while. But on the other, you can't be too arrogant to the point that you stop taking advice, that you stop growing, that you stop learning. You know, so it's a balancing act in many ways. You know, you have to learn to take the right advice, and sometimes you have to learn to ignore the people that are telling you things that don't actually matter. In terms of getting poetry published, you know, luckily there's a lot of great presses that only publish poetry, and so I think that you can definitely direct your work to presses where they don't have those silly differentiations. You know, also because, you know, to prove how publishing often gets it wrong, there's been plenty of poets who have written fantastic novels and fantastic memoirs that have sold far more than works by other kinds of writers that don't write poetry. So I think that, you know, seeing poetry as something that's commercially unviable is completely ridiculous, especially now. You know, it used to be true that 15 years ago poets didn't have agents. Now they almost all do, you know, and that tells you something, because, you know, as that teacher in Scotland once told me, you know, the reason why poets didn't have agents before is because 15% of nothing is still nothing. But these days, if they have agents, it's because they're making a commission somewhere. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of preconceptions to wade through, but yeah, you try and do your best while staying true to yourself also, because I think that if you ever feel the temptation to write something that you consider to be popular and that you think will make you successful, I guarantee you it's not going to work out. You know, unless it's something that you were meant to do. You know, so trying to bend to someone else's desires and expectations, it's not going to work out for the most part.
Thank you.
Yeah. And to pick up on that, Andre, so you believe, for example, that mentorship programs are important. They train the poet or the writer, you know, what to do, how to take criticism, how to progress, you know, maybe tame a little bit of that arrogance that you were speaking about that some poets might have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the idea of mentorship is always valid, and I think, frankly, there's different paths to it, in the sense that I think mentorship can take various forms. You know, it can take place in a university setting, like with a creative writing MA or NFA, as the Americans call them. It can also be an informal relationship that writers can develop amongst one another, because that still happens quite a bit. It doesn't get talked about, but it does. It can also take the shape of informal writing groups where you don't pay in order to belong to them, because you have to keep in mind the financial limitations of a lot of these mentorships, right? Um, I edit Poetry London in London, and we do a mentorship scheme as well. And it's something that's open access. And that pairs, younger poets with older poets, or more established poets. It's not an age question. And so, yeah, I think that the mentorship is key, but it can take form in various ways, and I think all of them are worthwhile. I mean, I think that extends to the concept of education in general. I dropped out of school when I was 15. I did not complete high school. I sat my exams with the British Council at the age of 18, and then I went to university. So the fact that I'm a high school dropout didn't stop me from going to university. So, just like with education, mentorship can take various different forms.
Wow, that's an interesting fact. Yeah, and I mean, we were having this little talk backstage before we came out here, and we were saying that a degree in literature does not guarantee that you are a good poet, and sometimes they are completely unrelated. As a matter of fact, the whole notion of getting a degree is kind of nowhere in the scene, So there were great poets way before universities and high schools were invented even. It's your way of responding to life. And of course, the mentorship that you just spoke about in all of its forms, it's very important to help set the poet on the right track. We have one more interesting question here, and Rashid asks, you mentioned that writing was not your first love. So how did you start loving writing?
Well, I think the right answer to that, and thank you, is the fact that I suppose I wanted to be an archaeologist because I think at the time, because this was around the ages of 6, 7, I'd actually started watching TV programs where I would see these archaeologists go and do these digs, but I never actually seen or met any writers. So I think the reason I decided to be archaeologist first is because I knew that it existed as a profession, and I think it also seemed to have this connection with my father's work. My father's an architect; he spent his entire life in construction sites. So I thought, two different kinds of holes, but still you're involved in the dirt and you're digging things up and setting things up. And I think writing came later because I understood that it was a real profession. I only really started hearing what we might call serious literature when I was about 12. That's when I started reading serious books, and the idea quickly followed afterwards. But I think this is only something that I can tell you logically now. But I think at the time, subconsciously, there was the understanding that what attracted me most about history was human stories. And so the transference between history and archaeology to writing is actually fairly natural, because when regardless of what form you're dealing with, it's about people. It's about understanding the lives of others, lives that you may not otherwise have access to. It's a kind of fellowship. So I think that's that was the connection between the two, but I'm not going to pretend that that's the kind of thought process I had at the time. That would be ludicrous.
Right, fascinating answer. We have Vasiliki Albedo asking, so beautifully observed, so deeply felt, exquisitely told. I really enjoyed this reading and look forward to the new collection. Thank you all for this afternoon. My question is around the airing of the dirty laundry. How do you go about it? Do you get permission from the people concerned? Are there poems you've written that you have decided for reasons of privacy not to publish?
Great question. Thank you. And thank you for the comment too. Yeah, that's a really good question. Dirty laundry. Yeah, I mean, I think that how do I go about it? First of all, I establish wherever it actually happens. So I think whatever dirty laundry I've used in my book, in Promised Land, for example, it most definitely happened. And I think that's something that I think has to be the first measure. And I think if memories proves uncertain, I think there's ways of rectifying that. I was able to, with certain images and statements and scenes that I wanted to portray. I think the question of seeking permission, it's an interesting one. I think ideally there should be some kind of consensus, but I think you can't also rely on it exclusively, in the sense that I think writers tend to find, and I've certainly had those issues with my family, and it helped me to know that almost every other writer who I've met who has dealt with family life means that everyone's going to disagree with your perception of things, in the sense that especially when they're being portrayed themselves, so unsurprisingly, because this is not shocking information for any of us here, people don't like to be written about negatively, or don't like to be written about in a way that releases private information that they think is private but actually isn't private at all. I think that there's a line to be drawn. I think that there are some poems that I've written where I felt that, without giving too much away, that the person in question did not have the strength, perhaps, to see themselves being written about in a certain way, and so I decided to not contribute to any potential hurt, and so I self-censored myself, essentially. It wasn't a comfortable choice. It's still one I have trouble with at times, but I think that's the way that I resolved it personally. Earlier I mentioned Robert Lowell, and he famously decided to use some very private letters that his wife had sent him and turned them into poems. And I think he definitely crossed the line there, also because I think that the volume of it, I think, is different as well, in the sense that it was a very long book, and it was almost entirely drawn from the letters. So I think that there are lines to be drawn. So yeah, I won't claim to have any specific kind of how-to guide that is universally morally acceptable. I think these are decisions that you have to make on your own. And it's part of the risks that you have to take, also because air laundry, it's not just a personal thing, it's also a political choice. And then all the consequences that flow from that decision. So it's a difficult one. And I think what might help the most is the understanding that everyone has feelings, and that you may end up hurting them. And I think something that you could do, I certainly did, was show it to them. So for example, when I wrote about members of my family, I showed them the poems before they were ever published. Although I'll tell you this, because it's actually kind of interesting, and I've heard this from other writers, when you show it to them before it's published, they feel one way, but after it's been published, they feel another. So people can change their mind, obviously, because they also know that it's being read. It also depends on how successful the work is being, so it's tricky. It's very tricky. But I think so long as you keep in mind why you're doing this, is there a good reason as to why you're airing some dirty laundry? And are you taking care, about the people that may feel differently, and then open yourself up, I think I've never been shy about saying, if people disagree with something I've written about, please tell me, I think conversations can be had, that's the point of it.
It's interesting to know that people, especially family members or people that they change their minds after whatever you wrote is published. Do you feel that they tend to become more accepting to what you wrote, or do they start feeling more vulnerable about it?
Usually more vulnerable, actually. Usually more vulnerable, and I think also something that has to be kept in mind is the fact that as a writer, you are potentially financially profiting from revelations involving another person. And so there's a sense in which the subject may feel themselves to have been betrayed or being shortchanged. I think behind every autobiographical writer, there's usually some kind of argument or lawsuit even. I've been lucky to not have that extreme side of things, but I think it's a psychological thing. Without getting too complicated, I think it's one thing to say, okay, here's a printed out piece of A4 that I'm showing you, and then you go, okay, it's another to see it in a bookshop, so it's I mean, I think everyone here is perhaps sometimes they've signed up to things and then they've gone, oh, wait a minute, this may not be the best decision I made, and now I've changed my mind. And I think that that's fine too. I think people are obviously allowed to change their minds.
Of course. We have a question by Mohammed Barakat. Mohammed says, I have a quick question. Some people are not interested in poetry because they think it is complex, because when they think of poetry, they think of Shakespeare. So how would you persuade people to give modern poetry a shot?
Yeah, good question there too. Yeah, I think sometimes, the way it's interesting that, a lot of poets teach, and it's strange that we haven't done enough yet to really change the way that literature is taught, because I think we tend to do a lot of damage at an early age and prevent people from appreciating beautiful work properly. I mean, I remember part of the reason I actually dropped out of school is because I felt that I wasn't being taught the subject that I loved in a way that actually pleased me. And so I decided to study on my own. I remember just before leaving school, I used to hate the poetry of Sylvia Plath because it was being taught in a particularly annoying way. And then she became one of my favorite writers. So I think that the way that we teach certain writers, or all of them, in certain ways, I think can impair our appreciation of it, and they can also limit our understanding of what poetry can do. But I think something we have to keep in mind, there's a reason why it's one of the oldest art forms that humanity's used throughout its history. It's a simple reason for that. There's no such thing as language without poetry. So long as we've had language, we've had poetry. Poetry is just a natural form of expression that arises from that. And so I think that the responsibility there is to be true to your times. I think what troubles me most about certain, because there's nothing wrong with Shakespeare. I mean, he wrote some wonderful things. Nothing wrong at all, frankly. Some beautiful work, but to look at that work and think that that's the only thing poetry can do, yes, that's very frustrating, and that's wrong too. I think being true to your own times is key. Because Shakespeare is being true to his. I can definitely tell you that. I know enough about the history. He was being true to himself, and he's being true to his times. And so I think that so long as so the advice I would give there is, does the world around you inspire you to write in a certain way? And if it does, examine also how you're able to communicate. Because one of the reasons, for example, that I decided to be pretty plain with the way I write is my desire is always to communicate, to have a conversation, to have a dialogue. I'm not interested in seeming clever with le mot juste. It's not the point of this.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, most of the time, when I'm teaching the Introduction to Literature course and we reach the poetry section, students are absolutely terrified, because for them, poetry is something that they don't understand. It's something that they cannot relate to, although poetry is about life. And as you said, the key is to be true to your time. And perhaps they're not given, or they're not taught pieces of poetry that help them realize that. And then, I teach contemporary poetry in my literature courses because I feel that, this is a very important connection, especially also with events like indelible evenings and other indelible events where the students can actually hear the poets reading. And as you saw, I mean, some students said that, oh, this is the first time I understand a poem. Well, it's because they are in contact with, the poetry that is true to our time. And yeah, I totally agree. And I can really relate to what you said. And thank you so much, Andre. Wow, you've had the longest Q&A session that we've ever had in the festival or indelible evenings. And thank you so much for answering the questions so well and, from your heart. Thank you for your poetry. Thank you for discussing it with us and sharing it with us. Good news for everyone who's here. Andre will be reading again on the 8th of April during our poetry and diaspora panel. And if you are interested in publishing your work, we will be having an editor's chat as the very last event of the festival on the 15th of April. Andre will be there, and he will be talking about the challenges and the pet peeves and the good stuff, and the science behind rejections and accepting poems. So bring your questions, be there, and we hope to see you all soon. I've also shared in the chat box, if you can see, if anyone would like to add Indelible on social media, just to stay in the loop of things and get some regular updates about what's on and what's next. We have the Instagram, the Twitter, the Facebook pages, and also the YouTube channel. This session, like the others, will be on YouTube by tomorrow. So again, feel free to subscribe. It's free. Everything's free. And you can watch it as soon as it comes out, and share it, of course, with your friends and family. So André, this is a great honor. We can't wait to have you back again. And we look forward to hearing some of your poems on next Friday. So is it going to be from your new collection?
I think
we
for the next event, probably, yeah.
Okay.
Probably from the new collection, yeah. And thank you so much, Lily. It's been an honor.
Thank
and a
you,
privilege.
André.
And
Thank
thank you to
you.
all of you for listening,
you.
for your kind comments, questions, your time. Thank you. I really
Thank you so
appreciate it.
much. It was a lot of fun, and everybody have a great evening or day, depending on where you are. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.